Ira Sachs, hello.
Nice to be here.
It's Pride Month, and we are having this conversation about queer topics in movies. We have a special selection of queer movies on MUBI for Pride Unprejudiced program. I will begin with a kind of personal memory, but as a queer teen, for me, it was really important to see representation on screen. And I have a clear memory of when the first time I saw My Own Private Idaho by Gus Van Sant.
Right.
Do you have a personal memory about one or several movies that shape you, help you with your identity at this moment of your life?
The first thing that comes to my mind is seeing Grease, actually. I have a very, very strong memory of seeing the movie Grease, which is made by a gay man and stars John Travolta, and I think turned me on. So I feel like that's probably the beginning for me to some extent. I went to the movies to see Grease in Memphis, Tennessee, and when it opened, so like 77, with my best friend, and we saw the movie, and then afterwards we walked about a mile to his house, and when we got there, we just thought, why didn't we stay and watch it again? Like, we wanted more of whatever was there. And I guess for me, it was right at the age of puberty, and there was something very erotic about that film. And then I think, then there was different kind of representation, which became important to me during college, films like Prick Up Your Ears, a lot of British cinema. Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, which seems to have disappeared, but was a really important movie to me. My Beautiful Laundrette, that period.
Stephen Frears is one of the most important of these years for you.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. And then later there were so many movies, and Fassbinder and Visconti and Pasolini and other things that have become maybe more central to my identity as a queer filmmaker. You know, when I think about making Passages, I think one of the things we wanted to do was make a film that turned people on. Like, that was something that I believe cinema is there for.
What was important for you in the beginning when you were writing your first movie?
I wanted to make films that were personal. So I made a film called The Delta, which I wrote in the mid-90s, maybe 10 years after having been a teenager in Memphis, Tennessee, and having left. I wrote a film that was set in Memphis that was loosely inspired by my own experience, but ultimately I made a contemporary film. So I kind of wrote a film from the past, which became a film about the present. Which I think is maybe what always happens, is that my films sort of shift between coming from my head to being observant about reality and what's in front of me.
During these years, mid-90s, in Europe and perhaps more particularly in France, we did see a kind of normalization of this kind of topic. I think about François Ozon, Christophe Honoré, or Catherine Corsini. But we were focused on gay experiences, queer characters, but the queerness or the gayness of the characters were not the topic, the main subject of the movie. Do you think you were part of this kind of movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I could never separate gay experience from other things that make up character and drama. I'm always interested in as much as I can reveal about a character. It's interesting because we talk about progress, and I think with queer cinema particularly, it doesn't go in one direction. Like, you talk about a set of filmmakers in France that we don't have a similar set in the US because they haven't had that kind of support as filmmakers. And I think most of the gay filmmakers in New York and in the US have gone on to make less gay films as they become part of the system, because it's very challenging to figure out sustainability. But I did come to New York in the late 80s, and it was a time of a birth of queer cinema in the US. So I think people like Todd Haynes, who was making Safe and Poison. With Poison, I was at the first screening of the film, and that was a really important movie for me. Discovering Chantal Akerman around that time. I mean, I continue to go back to Je tu, il, elle as often as possible, and I think was a big influence on Passages. So, and discovering, I think for my generation, discovering Fassbinder and Fassbinder becoming part of our imagination was sort of like discovering a family member in a certain way. Like it was very, very intimate.
From Greece to Chantal Ackerman or Fassbinder, were you more touched by a kind of queer aesthetics?
I would say suddenly what pops to my head is Nestor Almendros. I feel like that's queer aesthetics, like seeing desire in the images. I think was very important to me, and is something that I recognize in queer makers. L'Homme Blessé, the French Chiraud film, that film really stuck with me because it seemed very deeply a film about compulsion, which I think is at the heart of all queer cinema, to a certain sense.
You were talking about the difference between making a film in the US and in Europe about this kind of topics. Are they still existing for you?
The challenge is to get the money, but once the money is there, I feel like there have been very similar experiences for me because I pulled together a group of collaborators who I have an affinity with. So I don't feel that the mode of production is so different. I think there's a history that has been in queer European cinema that I felt very engaged with. There's also a kind of freedom around the representation of the body. And so for example, a film like Taxi Zoom Clos was very important to for me and to my actors in terms of making passages. Like, this can be done.
Do you think there is still a specific need of representation, which is perhaps more extended than it was before, because the queer family is more extended, and I think about trans characters or trans directors?
I think everybody wants to see versions of themselves in the movies, and I think the history of queer cinema is also the history of the metaphor. Mm-hmm. And then in a way, the metaphoric film is a way for people to have talked about queer desire throughout Hollywood. And I think that's actually really complicated, because I think the metaphor becomes a way not to talk about actual representation and actual experience. So there's like this challenge between what is theoretical and what is direct and narrative about our lives that gets lost in that process.
I know that you wanted that Passages was a kind of erotic movie. Mm-hmm. What is your reflection about showing sex scenes and queer sex scenes on screen?
It relies on the actor or actress, the liberty that the performer feels with themselves and with their bodies is something that the director can't impose. The actor gives me those scenes. There's always this risk, because you set something up which is a kind of narrative scene around intimacy, and then you say, do it. And obviously they're not having sex, but they are sort of going through a kind of story about sex that is very revealing. I guess to some extent what happens is that there's a trust that exists between the performers and between the performers and then with me as well.
About queer movies, what would be your hopes to see some kind of shift in the future?
Well, I think globalization has made queer cinema more rare and more difficult to produce. Because if you can't sell the film in Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Japan, then there's a way in which it doesn't seem to have value. So the specific of gay experience is maybe harder to find the money for. So and what I see is that in my generation, it's been very hard to sustain careers telling queer stories. So the career like a Pasolini, or the career like a Fassbinder, or in France like Ozon or Chiraud, those are harder for people to make. I guess what I want for younger filmmakers is to continue to watch the films that were explosive of what we could expect in the image. And I think that there's a way in which we have to be reminded, and I certainly feel that's the way myself, about what is possible and how frank we can be and how true we can be.
Is there any young directors that you feel some kind of communion with?
There's a whole bunch of young directors coming out of Brazil, queer filmmakers who seem to be making extremely radical work, which I find inspiring and provocative. So I think you always want to find people who are doing things that you don't think you can do. That seems important to developing as an artist.
You were talking about Brazil, but the big evolutions in queer movies were always when the political regime were really strict or difficult, and perhaps it's due to Bolsonaro and all the social issues in Brazil, like it was due to the American government during the new queer cinema explosion.
Right. I think that I came to New York in full-time in 1988, and it was the heart of the AIDS epidemic, and I got involved with ACT UP, and as did most of my friends, and it was urgent, and it was also a place in which you felt you had permission to be your most radical self. And I find that I have to go back to that time constantly as a filmmaker. I have to think like, what boundary can I push that I've forgotten as I got older and as I got more comfortable and as I got a certain amount of success? Like, what seems like more necessary now? And for me, actually, the East Village in New York, the whole art scene there from the 80s has been very, very important. I mean, punk rock and drag and activism and bars and sex and all those things are kind of part of my history.
Would you have a kind of list of three or five movies to absolutely discover when you are a queer young cinephile?
Avant j'oublie, Jacques Nolo's film Before I Forget,
J'oublie,
changed my life.
Yeah.
Really changed my life. Like, I walked into a cinema in New York City on 12th Street. I saw that movie and I had a different direction. So that film gave me permission to be more personal, more direct, more exposing, more honest, and also that film's so beautiful. I ended up, the cinematographer of Passages shot that movie. So that was like an important relationship to me. Chantal Akerman's Je tu il elle is a film it's very short and it's very, very powerful. And I go back to it and I sort of see how exposed. I have an image in my head of Chantal and a woman in a bed in a corner, and the room is very, you see everything. There's no shade. Taxi Zoom Clos. Mm-hmm. You know, all three of these films, what Taxi Zoom Clos, Before I Forget, Avant j'oublie, and the Akerman film have in common is they star the director of the film, which I don't do because I can't act. But I think it's that's a metaphor that I appreciate, which is that the director is inside the film, and you can't separate the film from the director.
Do you feel that even if you're not on your movies?
I've noticed that my movies, you could say they're all about men behaving badly.
Kind of.
You can take that one and think about it, but it's true. They're sort of examinations of maleness in the world, and I think that is not something that I do out of guilt. I don't experience a lot of guilt. I experience many other of the major emotions, but guilt is not the central one for me. Shame, envy, desire.
Gay couple is one of the most important topic in your movies too.
I've almost always had a boyfriend or a partner.
And
I think there's certain people who just find themselves looking, and when I was younger, it was a desperate look. I don't want the same way that I did, but I still want a lot. And I think that's in a way what Passages is about. Is that they're all three characters want great things, want big things in their lives. I mean, there's this conflict, I think, between the bourgeois and the bohemian, between the safety and the risk, which I think is where suspense comes from in these movies, all of them.
And perhaps a question common with Visconti, Fassbinder, and you is...
Sorry, I've never heard that sentence before. But
can we still be politically queer when we have a home? When we are some kind of bourgeois?
That is kind of, to me, something that I accept is my bourgeois nature. Like it's just inherent to who I am, and it's something that I can't. It's, you know, I think if you read novels, you know, I'm reading Trollope now, or if you read Henry James, character is money, character is position, social class and position. So I think these things are also central to any character's identity and experience in a film. But I think maybe to me sexuality has been a driving force even more than that.
Is it important for you how to show it? Is there
Well,
a lot of reflection about that?
I think the hard thing about sex in a film is it's usually very boring. What I try to do is figure out what is the narrative of the intimacy. The scene has to tell a story, and I think that's the challenge. But I also think we put clothes on, and queer cinema is always in conflict with like how much will be dressed and how much will be undressed. And I think for me, sex is part of being vulnerable as an artist.
You were a child, I think, in '69 during Stonewall events.
Yes.
But does Pride Month, Pride celebrations mean something strong for you?
My niece, who's 26, works at a organization that supports non-documented immigrants, mostly LGBT queer kids who've come to America without papers and are trying to figure out how to be themselves and how to live. And they are so excited about Pride. Like, it's very moving to me. They're excited about getting on the street and carrying a banner, and I think that's yeah, it's really beautiful. And it reminds you that it's not simple to be a gay person.
Thank you, Ira, for this conversation. That will be part of the Pride Unprejudiced program on MUBI.
Thank you for that. It was a pleasure. You made me think. So that's all I ask for.